Well, hello, welcome. This is going to be a brief review of the chapter entitled Recognizing, Analyzing, and Constructing Arguments. I'm your facilitator, and I hope all is going well for you. At the time at which I'm actually performing this little mini-canned broadcast, we're about 2 weeks away from the midterm examination. And if you happen to access this particular presentation once it's put up on our website in a timely fashion, then you'll also be apprised of the fact that there will be a question pool that will be placed up in the course. And we'll still work on exactly what the times and the windows will be of opportunity for you to be able to take that test. It'll be based upon all of the chapters that we've managed to discuss up until the time, approximate of the midterm. And again, I'll get you some more detail. One thing that we definitely want to be aware of is how it is that we should not only avoid rhetoric, as we've discussed previously, and informal fallacies, but at the same time, the structure of our arguments. How are our arguments structured? And that's what this presentation is about. If you want to continue to pursue, by the way, some really interesting issues, I think at least they're interesting, that have to do with informal fallacies and the way in which they get used in advertising, here's one of many websites that you can find on the internet. And by clicking on them, you'll see that there certainly seem to be some relatively common themes and some, of course, appeals to various kinds, one would think, of fallacies. This one is probably appeal to emotion or appeal to popular views about the way we should look or how we should behave. This particular website was done courtesy of Stanford University, and it is concerns the abundance of advertisements that have been done advertising alcohol. So you can kind of tell that there's some relatively clever things that are going on here. What beer judges drink between competitions, this probably is a form of a fallacy. But it's very interesting when you think about this hypothetical question down here. If judging beer were your job, how would you spend your day off? Conclusion, enjoying the remarkably smooth taste, etc., etc. Well, this is all just blown out of proportion, hyperbolic, and at the very least, somewhat emotionally charged or overstated language, and probably contains a bit of a fallacy. And of course, a fallacy is, as we described previously, kind of a counterfeit form of reasoning. It leads you astray. So if you were actually to sit down and apply some kind of critical thinking skill, you'd probably want to recreate this as an argument, which I admit would probably seem to you to be a little bit of a waste of time and silly. We all know that there's not necessarily much that is supposed to appeal to your reason here. But still, you'd probably decide what the conclusion is, which is drink Michelob. Why? Because that's a better way of spending your day off, and because of the fact that judges who judge competitions drink it too, which seems to be at the very least a non sequitur and irrelevant to the whole issue about whether you should be drinking beer. But you might want to play with that just a little bit. It's a very interesting little website. There are several others out there. Arguments help us to analyze issues and to assess whether positions on an issue are reasonable or unreasonable. And one way of looking at an issue is that it's not well defined. It's a problem. There are some authors who suggest that an easy way of identifying an issue is to raise it in the form of a kind of question, whether or not such and such is the case or should be believed, like whether or not there should be a national health care system. That's the issue, whether or not there should be national health care. Then with that issue, you would take a position, presumably, such that you would construct an argument in answer to the issue. That's pretty much the way that goes. When we start with what we call a position statement or a thesis statement, we are perhaps beginning to try to get beyond just simply the use of rhetoric. If you just simply say, well, this is what I believe and this is my opinion, and you don't provide an argumentative explanation for it or justification for it, more properly speaking, then you're engaged in a form of rhetoric. Rhetoric has been classically known as the art of persuasion. It's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing, but if you're going to persuade somebody, it should at the very least be with good reasons. You should, from a critical thinking point of view, apply your reasoning skills and allow other people to employ their own critical thinking analyses and evaluation of what you have to say. So in other words, you're not just simply trying to persuade people by pushing all the appropriate buttons to get them to believe a specific position, the one that you happen to endorse. you're persuading them for logical reasons. Oftentimes what we say is rhetoric is what seems in practice to persuade, but logic is what really ought to persuade. The only problem with rhetoric is that if it's substituted for what we call unbiased research, logical argumentation, then there can be a problem. And that's exactly what happens with advertising and fallacies, for the most part, I would say. The purpose of rhetoric is basically to persuade people, and yet the purpose of argumentation is to discover the truth. That may seem corny, but what we're attempting to do is to try to find the truth about a specific issue. And we argue for the sake of trying to justify that position. And it may end up that we have to change our position if we find that we can't really argue terribly well because we either can't find any facts or we can't really generate a terribly good argument to support our view. What that means is we may have to change our view or suspend it until we are able to, in fact, find the facts or find a good argument that supports that view. Arguments are normally open to multiple perspectives in a sense in which you just kind of put them out there for people to look at and analyze. Arguments are generally made up of two or more propositions, one of which is a conclusion, and is supported by the other, the premise, which basically, if you take a look specifically at this statement, means you can have a one-premise argument. You can actually have an argument that only consists of a single premise. And what will happen there is that it probably is going to be unless it's just begging the question or circular argument, it's probably going to be, if a one-premise argument, an inductive argument. But basically, and you probably have heard this somewhere before, there are two types of arguments that we are concerned about. One is deductive, and a deductive argument is said to contain a conclusion that necessarily follows from the premise or premises, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. And an inductive argument, where the premises provide support, but not necessarily proof of the conclusion. Very important that you realize that a deductive argument, a valid deductive argument, contains a conclusion that necessarily follows from the premises, even if the premises are not true. In an inductive argument, obviously truth is extremely important there, but you could have an extremely good inductive argument, and yet it may be that the conclusion only follows with a high degree of probability, which is what you're going to strive for if you choose to argue inductively. In our arguments, we use propositions. They are statements that express a thought, and we say that a proposition can be either true or false. It must be one or the other, and it cannot be both. So when I say must be, I'm simply saying that if you're going to use propositions in your argument to try to demonstrate or substantiate a point in your conclusion, then of course what you want to do is to find factual propositions and premises. In an argument, we have a conclusion. That's the main claim of the argument, and it's supported, or it may be, depending on how you're arguing, denied on the basis of other propositions that are serving as reasons. These also may be called claims, viewpoints, positions. In any case, those claims and viewpoints are arrayed in such a fashion that they relate to the conclusion and justify the conclusion in a well-formed argument. Premises, basically, that's a term we refer to those propositions that support or give reasons for the acceptance of the argument's conclusion. And we generally go from premise to conclusion. But often what happens is you have a claim, and you feel that you want to try to justify that claim, so you fish around, if you will, for premises that relate to the claim and justify it. The kinds of premises we're looking for, of course, are ones that are based on bona fide anecdotal experiences, certainly fact, research, appropriate statistics, and appropriate sources of authority. Kinds of premises that you can have include things such as descriptive premises, which are based on empirical facts, scientific observation. Those are very common. Prescriptive premises are those in which there are value statements, such as what you should or should not do, and including certain kinds of norms that serve as, you might say, ethical postulates in some instances. They can be prescriptive or they can be used as premises. What we call analogical premises has to do with basically making a comparison from one thing to the next. And then definitional premises, when it's appropriate, should contain the definition of a key term for purposes of precision or clarification. Remember, that goes back to the chapter on the kinds of definition you can have in order to reduce vagueness and ambiguity. We should contrast arguments with non-arguments that sometimes can look quite a bit like each other. What we call an explanation is a statement about why or how something is a case. And a way to look at that is to say that an explanation is about something we already pretty much regard as a fact. You know, when we talk about why there are so many moons around Saturn, in excess of 9, 10, 12, 14. We keep finding more satellites around the planet Saturn. We probably arrive at a conclusion already that based upon our experiences, our observations, our telescopic views of that planet and its surrounding terrain, we already know, or we think we know at least, that it is a fact that there's so many planets around so many satellites around the planet Saturn. But we have to explain it. So the explanation tends to go in a slightly different direction. We have a fact that needs to be explained. An argument takes facts in order to explain something that is not already regarded as a fact. That's why you're generally always moving into a new domain of knowledge when you use argumentation, whether it's inductive or deductive, really. Conditional statements such as if, then, in and of itself, is not an argument, although the if looks like it's introducing a premise and the then looks like it's introducing a conclusion. We regard what is called an if-then statement as a single premise that's either true or false, must be one or the other, but not both simultaneously. We're going to now discuss a little bit about how to diagram and identify parts of an argument based to some extent upon what your book says about that. And, when you have an argument, it might be out of a newspaper, might be, from some other source in a textbook somewhere, could be an argument in a textbook is being advanced to support a thesis. Take a look at what the propositions are, put a bracket or parentheses around them, take a look at the conclusion, take a look at what the premises are. In other words, how do all of the propositions function? Some, in a good argument, will function better as premises. Other propositions will function better as candidates for the conclusion. Other steps to take when you're diagramming an argument, and again, I would go back to the book and refer to some of this for greater detail, but I just want to highlight it so that you'll know, and maybe I'll give you a little example here that will help. I want to highlight it here so that you'll know that it's rather important as a practical matter to be able to have some methodology when you're attempting to diagram arguments, using a very common sense and intuitive way of doing so. You can have a circled number indicating what proposition is what. What you think the proposition is premise number 1, circle 1 and put it next to it. Broken circle, not atypically used to indicate what we call an unstated premise or conclusion. An unstated premise is often an assumption that is lurking in the background that we're not fully aware of. We use a line to connect independent premises. We use an arrow to indicate the relationship between an independent premise and a conclusion. And a line with an arrow below it used to indicate the relationship between dependent premises and a conclusion. And I want to discuss that now a little bit with you. If you were to review the movie Diet for a New America that came out approximately 1991-92, done by that marvelous world perspective changer, so to speak, paradigm shifter, John Robbins. I'll have a link to it in the course that you can actually click on if you want to take a review of it. You'll discover that Diet for a New America is basically a kind of video-oriented argument. And generally, if you look at the video from start to finish, it's about an hour long. You'll probably, like most people, come to the conclusion, which I think is reasonably well stated throughout the video. And that is something like this. We should probably eat less meat. Why? Because meat is not good for human health or nutrition. Why? Because eating meat produces an adverse effect on the treatment of animals. Why? Because there are environmental effects, particularly with respect to water, pollution, contamination, nitrate problems in the aquifer, etc. This movie puts all these things together in sound bites, and basically what we have a situation here is in which we've got premise number 1. Again, this is the arrow that you would use. If you believe this, and there are good facts that support it, and statistics, and credible sources of information, then this is probably true. If you believe this, that is to say that animals are mistreated by mega agriculture, mega farms that basically treat them as woolly or feathery commodities, as the case may be, and subjects these animals to pain and suffering, and that's not a good thing. They probably think that this premise and the set of propositions which also sub-support this premise makes it likely that we should eat less meat. And of course the environmental issues, as I've just mentioned, If you think that's important, then you probably are led to this if you think there's a connection. Now, I would argue that in this particular movie, clearly the conclusion is related to the premises, so a condition of the premises in relation to the conclusion is satisfied. There is a relationship between these premises. The premises tend to ground this, but notice we're using a term probably. This could be an extremely good argument, and you might believe most of it and still not necessarily believe this. It still doesn't mean it's a bad argument. You may have good reason for rejecting some of what's being said here. But this conclusion isn't forced upon me. At the very best, it's a strong argument, meaning that there's very good support offered by one of these premises or by all of them kind of taken together, but in a loose sort of way. They're really independent of each other. Premise 1 does not depend upon premise 2 not upon premise 3 not upon premise 1 for this argument to work. This is could be potentially a one premise argument. You could be happy with just this one premise and this conclusion. But the author of this argument, primarily Mr. John Robbins, he probably is trying to get just about everybody to agree that this is a good conclusion. So there's kind of something for everybody. If you care about any of these things, you're probably going to, at the very least, see this as a challenge as to why you should continue eating all the meat that you and I do in our culture. The reason I put these premises here in this dotted circle is because if this is an important premise, the assumption is that our health is important to us. So it's what we call a suppressed premise or an assumption. The case is a little bit different with dependent premises. Here's an example. I'm going to go into more detail with an inserted movie in just a second here. If a human being is pregnant, then she's female. That could be premise number 1. It so happens that Jane is pregnant. Therefore, it follows that Jane is female. Now, in this particular case, you need both these premises. One will not do it. If I just said, if a human being is pregnant, then she's a female. Therefore, Jane is a female. I'm clearly missing something that under some circumstances might be a hidden assumption, if I were to use a circle method. But if I just straightforwardly indicate what the premises are and I regard them as true, then in a case of a valid deductive argument, then I must necessarily believe that the conclusion follows. So if the premises are true in a valid deductive argument, which is basically one in which there are dependent premises, it's like saying 1 plus 2 equals 3. 1 and 2 generates necessarily 3. Unlike the previous case where we were talking about independent premises in an inductive argument pattern, where the conclusion probably follows from the premises. In this case, if the premises are true, you cannot consistently believe the premises being true and the conclusion being false. Impossible, logically. You can go ahead and try, but it's impossible. Okay, what I want to do here is to actually go into a little bit more detail about an issue with respect to what we would call dependent premises in a deductive argument form, both valid and invalid. I want to show you. In the live section of the course, I used an example, and it is also in a PowerPoint, namely this one up here. If someone is pregnant, then that person is female. Jane is pregnant, therefore Jane is female. And I chose it as an illustration of what it means to have a valid deductive argument. In a valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must therefore necessarily be true as well. So if you agree that premise number 1, if someone is pregnant, then that person is female, is true, and premise number 2, Jane is pregnant, you might say that this would be an empirical fact, then you have to believe that Jane is also female. There is no other option. It is logically impossible for you to consistently believe the premises to be true and the conclusion false in a valid deductive argument form. So this is cited as an example of that. Now I see we have a little bit of reflection coming in here from my window, so I'm going to move this. Let us assume that these two circles stand for categories of things. And the way in which you want to do a preliminary Venn-type diagram in order to show the structural nature of this particular argument form, which we call a form of syllogism, we may refer to it as a syllogism, you can identify this big circle as the class of all females, and the small circle is a class of all persons who are pregnant, And then what you simply would do is let X represent Jane and simply try to fill in the missing variables, so to speak, from this circle. So again, what you have is a class of all females, the class of all pregnant persons. We are not assuming they are identical. They could be, but we are not going to make that assumption because that would be begging the question. And we're going to let X represent Jane, and by doing so we're going to put an X right here. What that circle is saying is Jane, that is to say X, is in the class of pregnant people. Now you can see that if the X represents Jane, and Jane is in the class of pregnant people, and the class of pregnant people is in the class of females, then if X is pregnant, then X necessarily must be a female. And that's one way to diagrammatically show the structure of this particular argument form. Remember, it doesn't really matter for an argument to be validly deductive what you plug into the premises as long as you're doing so consistently. You can put anything in there, including things that might appear to be nonsense. And sometimes if you play a little bit, and later on in our course we're going to discuss, both live and also in a canned form, some examples that will help you to see how to illustrate the relationship, the logical relationship between premises and conclusion. So we would call this one a valid deductive argument because of its form, and it just so happens that it's a hypothetical syllogism, and it is called modus ponens. There are several others we're going to be discussing. Modus ponens. So this one is done now. We know that it's valid, but let's go ahead just for kicks and pursue this a little bit further and show you in what way an argument form can go wrong, even if, for example, it resembles a valid form of argumentation. Let's just change it ever so slightly. Same first premise. If someone is pregnant, then that person is a female. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we're going to call it true. Let's say that it's true, too, that Jane is a female. We could even say that, as a matter of fact, Jane is pregnant, and that could be true. However, there is a bit of a problem here, and we might be able to determine what the problem is by going back to our diagram. Let me try to switch pens here so that we won't confuse the issue. We still have the class of, the larger circle representing a class of all females. And now we have changed this ever so slightly, the second premise. Jane is a female. So if we let our X represent the fact that Jane is a female, or Jane, rather, we have a question here now. Where are we going to put our X? If we just simply take it for what it's worth, we can put our X right here. And that would probably satisfy our diagram, in which case, if we have an X here under females and we're looking for Jane is pregnant, clearly we'd want an X right here, but it's not there. Now it's also possible, and you'll learn this when we do some categorical syllogisms and Venn diagrams to represent them, that because we do not know where to put the X that represents Jane, we don't want to beg the question about where it goes, so what we typically do is put it on a line. It's much more obvious when we use our three-circle Venn diagrams, as we will in a couple of weeks. And we just also put a question mark there because we do not know where that X is supposed to go. Unlike this example up here where we have a valid argument form, if we represent everything properly and consistently, we know exactly where that X that represents Jane is supposed to go, which is one of the reasons why we can definitely say that it is a valid deductive argument. In other words, it is an argument of the form such that if you plug in any variables consistently to that argument, you will always end up with a conclusion that necessarily follows. It cannot be otherwise. But in this case, while there may be some probability that Jane is pregnant, that conclusion is not forced upon us by these two premises taken together. It may or may not be that Jane is pregnant. Unlike, again, in the first case, we have no option. Jane must be female. But in the second case here, she may or may not be pregnant based upon, again, let me emphasize that, the way the premises are related to the conclusion. And once again, this diagram supports our view. We can't diagram it without coming to, at the very least, inconclusiveness about what the conclusion is about. A valid deductive argument requires that there is no doubt by the time you're done, structurally. Now, if you want to create a sound argument, of course, which is basically a valid argument with true premises, you want to make absolutely sure that your premises are true. But we've just said we're going to assume if the premises are true. If the premises are true, does the conclusion necessarily follow? In the first case, yes. In the second case, no. Although there may be some probability associated with it. So hopefully this will clarify just a little bit what the whole issue is with respect to argument structure and valid and invalid deductive forms. And remember that unlike the case of independent premises, which we simply previewed in our slideshow, this would be a situation in which we have dependent premises. The premises depend upon each other in order to get us to the conclusion. Alrighty? We'll be doing more of these examples in the future. Thank you very much. So now, when we evaluate arguments, there are 5 criteria that are frankly quite useful, and we've discussed them a little bit already. Clarity, credibility, relevance, completeness, and soundness. If you have these criteria met in an argument that you're evaluating, then you probably have a pretty good argument. And I would, again, think that in movies like Diet for a New America, that you're probably going to have most of those criteria met at, in one degree or another. Just to recap, you ask yourself the question about clarity. Is the argument pretty clear? Are there any ambiguous terms, or is it itself ambiguous? When you try to clarify somebody else's argument, and particularly if they're giving it verbally to you, you have to have good listening skills, keep your mind open to ideas that may differ from your own. So it's really like being, I suppose, a kind of a mini scientist. Credibility. The premises that are offered are supported by evidence. You have to do the next step, by the way, which is the hard part, and most of us don't do it. I don't think. And that's to examine each premise very carefully and be very much aware of the fact that people do make assumptions. Sometimes they themselves regard them as facts. Sometimes they deliberately pass off their assumption as facts. But when you hear political speech, and if you can turn it into an argument, then probably what you should be doing is sitting down and determining, what premises are being stated and whether or not those premises can be regarded as true or credible. Are the premises actually relevant to the conclusion? In some instances, people produce arguments that are highly complex or convoluted, and it ends up that maybe the premises that are offered don't really support that particular conclusion. Maybe what can happen is that the premises offered by somebody in an argument support some completely different conclusion that the arguer is not really ready to embrace or is aware of. Completeness. Are there unstated premises? Are there conclusions that are not necessarily stated point blank but can be inferred? And of course this can happen with incompletely researched conclusions, and what we discussed with confirmation bias, where a person is looking to prove a specific point, does not look at any counter evidence, has not provided a really complete perspective on the argument or claim that's being advanced. And I think that happens a lot with things like conspiracy theories. I'm not saying all conspiracy theories are this way, but some certainly are. And certainly ideas about UFO and extraterrestrial pilots visiting themselves upon the ancient Egyptians or the Mayans and helping them to make their temples and art objects. I think in many instances you're going to notice that the arguments that are offered, if they are indeed arguments to support those views, are bad arguments, largely because they don't meet any of these criteria terribly well. Soundness. This is one of those cases where you're saying, or asking yourself the question, are the premises true? And is the conclusion supported? And we say that a sound argument is one in which the premises are true and they support the conclusion. And we use that term very specifically and technically in the case of arguments that are said to be deductively valid with true premises. If you have a deductively valid argument with true premises, it is sound. Now you can use this to construct your own argument. Of course, in this class you have to do an argument paper. Once you know how to identify, deconstruct, and evaluate arguments, then you can construct your own. Here's some steps real quick that should help you, and then you can go back to the original PowerPoint on this and print these out, I suppose, if you had to. State the issue. Try to do it as neutrally and objectively as you can. Start constructing a list of premises. Remain as objective and open-minded as possible. By the way, these 8 steps are really good if you're collaborating on a group project. If you could just keep these before you in your mind or on a notepad as you begin to discuss with other people, for example, if you're doing some kind of a group work, This is a very good way of getting the discussion off the ground. Make a long list of premises. Then eliminate those that are irrelevant or weak. Try to come at least to a preliminary conclusion. Then start getting organized. And I have places in our course where I lay that out very clearly. There is a narrated how to write an argument paper link that's located in the Blackboard area. It takes you through this. There's some other learning objects that I've done called extended argument analysis and some others that are up there in the course, and you can view them and review them, hopefully not to the point where it makes you ill or extremely tired, but at least they're there, those items are there so you can get a better grasp on how to organize and evaluate an argument. Not a bad idea to test your argument out on other people, see what they say, make revisions as necessary based upon feedback and input, and then if it's appropriate, and that's a very important point, some arguments actually require us, it seems, to take action. Maybe that has to do with things like social policy, political issues, voting, buying. So if you tried to take these 8 steps really and apply them to an analysis, let's say of some of the more complex advertisements that you might get in your life, commercials, I think you'd probably find yourself coming to some really interesting insights with respect to the conclusions that are implicit or the assumptions that are not made explicit. If you want to write an effective paper, you should also bear in mind the structure, such as making an introduction in your first paragraph, presenting the premises, at least in brief form, in that paragraph, and then restate or recap. And we'll see these things also reproduced in the narrated presentations that are embedded in your Blackboard course. In the long run, critical thinking is all about arguments. Logic is somewhat more abstract with respect to arguments, but we have the practical end of this being that arguments are useful tools for making real-life decisions. And if you're going to remain a critical thinker to develop your skills, then it's important to be able to master the art of not only argument analysis, evaluation, identification, but also how to construct one yourself. Take care. Talk to you next time.